Hi everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why it feels so hard for governments to get big important changes like fighting climate change or dealing with pandemics done, especially when those changes mean new rules or taxes that people just don't like? Well, a new study might have some really interesting ideas about how to make that easier. Imagine your government wants to bring in a new rule that will affect a lot of people. Maybe it is a tax on sugary drinks or a new rule about cars to cut down pollution. These kinds of big changes, called system-level policies, are often necessary to solve huge problems. But here is the thing, before they even happen, people can get really upset. This is what the scientists call psychological reactance. It is when people feel like their freedom is being threatened, and they start to push back with negative thoughts and feelings before the policy even starts. This makes it super hard to get important stuff done. So, the big question this research asks is, can getting people involved in making these decisions help calm things down and reduce that resistance? The researchers decided to look into this. They combined a real-world example from the US with a bunch of experiments done in the UK with over 8,000 people. They wanted to see if having people participate in decisions, like through voting in a referendum or talking in a citizen forum, would make them less resistant to these big policies. And guess what they found? It seems like public participation really does reduce resistance even for people who didn't actually take part themselves. This happened across different kinds of policies, and it didn't really matter if the policy was about something people thought was super important or not, or even if they personally liked the policy or not. They also found some clues about why this happens, involving things like social norms, which are basically what most people seem to be doing or thinking. And fairness. So let's dive a bit deeper. We know that for really big problems like climate change or pandemics, we need big changes. Governments can try to nudge people's daily choices, but often these nudges don't have a huge effect. That is where system-level interventions come in. These are the bigger moves like bans, mandates, or taxes. That changed the whole system, but as we mentioned, these tend to cause a lot more public resistance, especially before they are put in place. This resistance is driven by that feeling of lost freedom, that psychological reactance. It creates a real puzzle for policymakers. The tools that can solve the biggest problems are often the hardest to get accepted. The researchers looked at two main ways people can participate in making decisions. One is through choice, like voting in a referendum where you can say yes or no to a policy. The other is through voice, like in a citizen forum where you can share your opinions and concerns. They knew from other research that when people feel involved, they tend to see decisions and their outcomes more positively. Just like in a workplace when employees have a say, but they pointed out that a lot of that research was from work settings, and it wasn't always clear if it would work for us regular citizens dealing with government policies. And an even bigger point was that most of us don't actually do the participating ourselves. We're affected by the outcome, but we didn't cast the vote or voice the opinion. This is called passive participation, and they wanted to see if hearing that others participated made a difference. So their main idea was pretty straightforward. If people feel like the public, or even just others, had a say in a policy, they would be less resistant to it, even before it's actually put into action. They also wanted to figure out why this might be. They had two main ideas. First, if lots of people participated, it might signal that this policy has broad support, creating a kind of social norm that makes others more accepting. Second, the process of participation itself might feel fairer, leading people to view the outcome more positively. First, they looked at a real-world situation, taxes on sugary drinks in different cities across the US. They looked at cities where these taxes were approved by people voting in referendums, and cities where they were decided by city councils. Then they analyzed news articles from before the taxes took effect. They used something called sentiment analysis, which is basically a way to measure how positive or negative the language in the articles is. More positive news sentiment, they figured, would mean less public resistance. And they did find that in cities where there was a referendum, the news coverage was more positive, suggesting less resistance compared to cities where the decision was made by the city council. This was a good first hint. But since it was observational data, they couldn't say for sure it was causing the effect. To get a clearer causal answer, they ran those 7 experiments with over 8,000 UK adults. In these experiments, participants were told their government was planning a system-level policy like a car ban, a car tax, or a meat tax. Then they were randomly put into different groups. Some groups heard about the policy without any mention of public involvement. That was their control group. Other groups heard that other people had participated in making the decision. This participation could be through a referendum, people voting, or a citizen forum, people discussing. Importantly, in most of these experiments, The participants themselves didn't vote or discuss. They just heard that other people had tested that passive participation idea. The main thing they measured was how resistant people were to the policy, using questions about feelings of anger, frustration, or a sense of restricted freedom. So, what was the overall finding from all these experiments, combining all the results? They found that just telling people that other citizens had participated in the policy-making process did reduce resistance to system-level policies. This was true whether the participation was through a referendum or a citizen forum. Interestingly, they also tested if just knowing that a participation event would happen in the future made a difference, and that had a much smaller effect, suggesting it is more about knowing that participation already happened and that the majority supported the policy that really calms things down. They also found that the resistance went down even if the policy regulated something people thought was really important to them, like driving their car, and it didn't matter if participants were already for or against the policy idea, participation still helped reduce their resistance. In one of the studies, they even went a step further and tested active participation, where the participants themselves got to vote or discuss the policy, not just hear about others doing it. And yes, actively participating also reduced resistance. But here is a really surprising thing. The reduction in resistance from active participation was pretty similar to the reduction from passive participation, just knowing that others had participated. This suggests that the feeling of collective decision-making, even if you weren't directly involved, carries a lot of weight. So, why does this work? The researchers looked into two main reasons. First, they explored social norms. They found that when people heard that the majority of others had supported the policy through participation, it was like signaling a strong social norm of acceptance. This made them less resistant. They even compared it to just being told that an independent poll showed majority support. And while that also reduced resistance a bit, the participation effect was stronger, suggesting it's not just about the number, but how that number came about through a process. Second, they looked at perceived fairness. When people learned about public participation, they tended to see the decision-making process as fairer. And this feeling of fairness fully explained, or at least partly explained, why their resistance went down. So essentially, it seems that when policies come from some form of public involvement, people see them less as top-down commands from unnamed authorities, and more as a collective decision from us, the public, and the policymakers together. Let's talk about what this all means. The core problem is that the policies that can make the biggest positive changes are often the hardest to get approved because people resist them. This research strongly suggests that public participation, whether it's through referendums or citizen forums, can be a powerful way to lower that resistance even for people who didn't actively participate. The effect, while small in absolute terms, are consistent and comparable to other known ways of reducing resistance. This is huge because it applies to the crucial stage before a policy is implemented, when resistance is often at its peak. The key takeaways are the roles of social norms and fairness. When a policy comes out of a participatory process, it signals that many people agree with it, leaning on those descriptive social norms. And the process itself feels fairer, which makes people more accepting of the outcome. It shifts the perception from them versus US to a more inclusive we. Now, like all good research, this study has its limitations. The researchers point out that they mostly looked at situations where participation led to majority support for the policy. They aren't sure if the effects would be the same if the participation process revealed strong opposition. Also, their studies were mainly with people in Western democracies. So how people in other cultures or political systems might react could be different. Lastly, they measured resistance as psychological reactance, which is strongly linked to actual behavior. But they suggest future studies could directly look at things like people actually complying with policies or protesting. So, what is the practical advice here for policymakers? It is about improving the ergonomics of public policy-making policies that aren't just effective on paper, but are also designed to be perceived and accepted by people. Public participation seems to be a key tool for this. Giving people that choice or voice can reduce resistance to policies that might otherwise be really controversial. A really important point is that the benefits of participation can spread. Policymakers need to not only create ways for people to participate, but also make sure the outcomes are communicated clearly. Letting people know the results of referendums or the reasoning behind citizen forum recommendations can extend those positive feelings to the broader public. The researchers also wisely point out that using participation has risks. What if the process reveals strong opposition? That's why it is crucial to involve people early in the policymaking process, so their input can actually shape the policy, rather than just feel like a rubber stamp. Early participation also reduces the chance that people see the process as just symbolic. Ultimately, this research circles back to the fundamental idea of democracy giving citizens a meaningful role. By shifting the feeling of control from distant authorities to a shared responsibility, public participation can help policies better match what people actually think and care about, making them easier to implement and more effective in the long run. It is a really hopeful finding that suggests a better way forward for tackling those big societal challenges we all face. What do you think? Does knowing that others participated in a decision change how you feel about a new policy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a like and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more explorations into the fascinating world of psychology and science. Well, see you in the next one.